this is my favorite topic, so I always get really excited when someone invites me to talk about D&I. I will also say that Vicki made the mistake of telling me that I can go past 1 because this goes till 1:30. So I've actually never gotten all the way through this talk in any version, anywhere I've ever given it, because I always have to cut it off. So you may be the first group ever that I can actually get through the whole thing. And basically, I'm excited to be here to talk to you for a couple of reasons. One is that, as Vicki said, I was a KL2 scholar with CCTS. I actually was in the KL2 program for almost 3 years. And it was amazing because it's actually how I discovered this area of research that I didn't know anything about. I didn't even know it existed actually when I started the KL2 program. I found out through talking with a program officer about a K23 application that I had planned on submitting until I found out 2 things. One was that I was too old and couldn't apply for it anymore because I took a very long and winding route to this position that I was in. But the other was that there was a name for what I was interested in, and there were people who were really leading the field, and she steered me in the direction of getting more training in this area. So then it completely changed my entire program of research, and it's pretty much all I've been doing since the KL2. And I'm really grateful to the CCTS because as a junior researcher, that program and the career development opportunities through CCTS really completely launched me. So I went from the KL2 and had an R34 funded. That was the project that I worked, that gathered all my preliminary data during the KL2 program for. And then after that, have an R01 funded now that's on the research that I'll talk a little bit about as an example. So that's exactly what the CCTS is supposed to do with junior faculty and developing people's research programs. So I'm eternally grateful to Vicki and Tom and everybody else at the CCTS. So what I'm going to talk about today is just an introduction to D&I, which is, people refer to it as D&I, and I recently realized that sometimes people don't even know that's like a D ampersand I, because people say it so quickly they don't know what that little phrase actually is. So it stands for Dissemination and Implementation Research, and I'm curious how many of you already know about this field, about this area a little bit. I know Anne does. Okay. So that's actually good because this is a pretty basic introduction to the field. It's pretty long, so I'm going to give you a lot of information, but it's a really good overview. And at the end of the talk, I will give you some opportunities and resources. If you find this interesting, there are a lot of ways that you can learn more about it that don't involve having to be in a costly program. Especially in the last year, a lot of resources have been made freely available that weren't available in the past. So often when we have people who are interested in learning more about D&I, there's no course currently here at UK that you can take. It's hard to find inexpensive training opportunities. There are training opportunities, but they tend to be kind of pricey. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that's only recently become available for free that I'll list at the end. So we're going to start off with what is D&I science. So everyone here, if you're doing anything with the CCTS, you should be very familiar with, if not this exact figure, this concept of translational science, coming from the very farthest left of the continuum, T0, basic science research, all the way to T4, where you're actually translating to communities. You can look at population outcomes, and at that point, the science is having a true benefit to society. And so D&I research typically falls on that end of the spectrum, somewhere between around the area where we're looking at effectiveness trials, translation to practice, and then ultimately translation to community and having population health impact. So this cartoon is sort of the whole point. So anybody here who's been doing research or been working in research labs knows that the NIH and institutions and other funders, people who volunteer to be in studies, researchers who spend their time, students who learn how to do research on their own. We do a lot of investment as a culture and a society and a country in research. But what tends to happen is that a lot of that research never actually goes to benefit patient health or public health or population health. So we have much research-based evidence produced, but not much of it is actually used. And that's especially a problem when you look at specific communities that are either under-resourced, underserved, or have limited access to high-quality or innovative medical or other types of social service care. So the question is, where does all that evidence go, and why do we have this gap? So in the past, we actually had to go to a physical library and look up stacks of journals. And if you think about how accessible that information is to people who are practicing in the field, whether it's in healthcare or mental health or education or social services, no matter what field it is, people can't access the evidence. And even if they can access the evidence, frequently it's published in a way that doesn't make it very usable in practice. And so it never actually reaches the people who, at the T0 end of the scale, we have people who are doing research that, they truly think that it's going to make a difference in the world. They truly believe that everything that they're researching could cure cancer someday or really improve quality of life for a specific health condition. But if we don't get it down to T4 and we don't get it into the hands of the people who can deliver the evidence, who can practice based on evidence, and who can make policies and encourage the inclusion of research into practice, then we really have wasted a lot of everybody's time, money, and effort. This, by Green, is kind of the quintessential picture of a figure that demonstrates why this happens. So if you take this pipeline and start on the left, then we think about the NIH or the CDC or all the funders who we work with. They have priorities for research funding, and that's where most research starts, is that they somehow get support to do it. You apply for grants, they're peer reviewed, so a bunch of things, great ideas maybe don't get funded and never get completed, and so we don't have data there. We have people who complete their grants, but then there are publication priorities in the peer review process, so sometimes people don't publish their negative findings or don't publish in high impact journals and people don't see them. Eventually, if you have enough data and enough evidence on something, then we might have a research synthesis, so somebody might do a meta-analysis or a systematic review. And then if we're really lucky and we have enough of that, we might actually move into guidelines for evidence-based practice from a college or some sort of institute that issues guidelines. And then, even when those guidelines exist, it's still only a tiny drop of actual practitioners who implement things the way that they were designed to be implemented, or who use the innovations the way that they're supposed to be used. So if you see from this side to this side, this is why we have kind of a drop of evidence from practice. So people will maybe pick up on a few things that they use routinely, but when new evidence comes out, it takes a very long time to get it into any kind of actual practice setting. So Russ Glasgow did this basically study and paper back in 2012 where he estimated, by looking at all of the NIH funding out there, that it takes 17 years to turn 14% of original research to actually benefit patient care. And that for every R01, for 33 funded R01s, one turns out to be usable and actually turns into something that impacts practice in some way and thus directly influences patient health and outcomes. So that's pitiful. It's really sad. And part of it is because of the way that we traditionally have done health research, where we do efficacy and effectiveness trials, but we do these in these very distinct stages, and it takes forever to get through. Like if you think about how long it takes to write a grant application, have it reviewed, get it funded, do the research, analyze the data, get it published, and then you're still on that, on this pipeline, you're still back here. Like we haven't even gotten there yet. So it's a very slow process, and the goal here would be to speed it up. So D&I science is focused on dissemination, adoption, reach, and sustainability of evidence-based interventions or programs or policies. It kind of captures a lot of evidence-based things by intended users. And in this field, we're really concerned with scaling up programs or interventions that we know work and increasing their public health impact. And really what we're asking is, what is needed for a particular intervention to be successfully implemented? And when I say intervention, I come from this world where we do these behavioral interventions, but this is the case for any kind of evidence-based practice, prescribing, policy, system. So an evidence-based intervention can be a lot of different things. I'll use the word intervention through this whole talk because that's just my language, but this is any practice that is based in evidence. So if we know that it works, why isn't it actually being why isn't it being used out in the field? So with D&I research, we hope to answer these questions. How do we increase uptake of the interventions in a wide range of settings? So it's not good enough that we just use these specific innovative practices in academic medical settings. Like, they should be used in every medical setting. How do we balance fidelity and adaptation of evidence-based interventions in the real world? So sometimes you come up with a great program or a great intervention, but when it gets out into the real world, and the infrastructure is different, and the people delivering it and receiving an intervention are different, sometimes changes have to be made to the intervention or the program to make it work. But when you do that, you've kind of degraded the quality. You're not doing exactly what the original researchers demonstrated worked. So how do you balance this need to adapt to certain settings with keeping a high level of fidelity to what the actual program or intervention is supposed to be? Another question that we look at is, what are the characteristics of organizations, providers, interventions, and communities that are associated with good implementation outcomes? So something that works in one setting may not work in another. Something that works in one state may not work in another. Something that works in one agency or one hospital system might not work in another. And it could be because of characteristics of those institutions themselves, but also the communities they're in, the people who are actually involved in delivering the intervention. There's just a lot of factors that can be associated with implementation. And then finally, what implementation strategies can help us reach good implementation outcomes? And I'll talk about this in a second, kind of in greater detail. But the idea here is that there might be things that we can do to improve the chances that innovations or evidence-based practices are actually delivered in real-life settings. So let's go to this little section, which is sort of the meat of implementation science. We're going to talk about what these outcomes are, what the determinants of the outcomes are, and then what those strategies are. So I just referred to all three of those. When we think about traditional health research, which is what most people in any kind of health-related program who are doing research focus on, we are looking at something, whether it's a medication, whether it is a surgical technique, whether it is a policy, whether it is a teaching style, whatever it might be. We've got this evidence-based thing that we're doing, and we look at the health outcomes or the mental health or the quality of life outcomes, depending on our field. And those are things like people's functioning and their satisfaction, their status, their symptoms. We're looking at those like patient level or kind of like the end recipient level outcomes. And that's how we determine if something is effective or not. But in implementation research, we're more interested in this box. And so the idea here is that, yes, eventually you get to those patient level or recipient level outcomes. But before you get there, if you're out in the real world, first, people have to actually be doing the thing that you think is going to have those results correctly. Like they have to be they have to be prescribing correctly. They have to be screening the right people. They have to be delivering this behavioral program the way that it was intended to be delivered. We're curious about things like, is it even possible? Like if you have a very complicated program that you've developed at an academic medical center, can you go out to like rural Eastern Kentucky to primary care and expect them to replicate it and do it the same way that we do it here? So that's a feasibility question. Fidelity is whether we do things the way that they were meant to be done. So somebody developed this, say it's a screening protocol. Is it actually being done the way it's supposed to be done? Or are people kind of tweaking it or leaving parts out or skipping steps because of whatever works in their setting? Penetration is really just whether something gets fully adopted in a system. So is there just one person, one physician in this one practice who's sort of halfway doing it, or has it actually become part of usual practice in that setting? Acceptability is what the individual people who are involved in the program think of it. Like, is this something that they think is worth doing, and does it work with their flow, and do they think that it's valuable? And also, if they're working with patients, do the patients think this is okay? Like, do they want this, whatever it is? Do they feel like this is an acceptable intervention? Sustainability is simply whether the delivery of whatever this intervention or program or policy, can it be sustained over time? Or do you have to put so much effort into it to keep it going that once that effort kind of alleviates a little bit, people stop doing what they're supposed to do? So anytime anybody who's worked in any field knows about like a new policy that has come down, like you're supposed to chart this way now, or you have to use this number instead of this one, it is really hard to get people to consistently do that over time. So sustainability is a really important question. Adoption is just whether people, it's like uptake. Like, do people use whatever this is that we're hoping that they're going to use? And cost, obviously, has a lot to do with sustainability, but also, can we afford to do this? So is this a really expensive medication, a really expensive procedure, a really expensive intervention, and it's just not going to fly because of the costs? Those then lead to health services outcomes, which I'm not going to talk about. And then the idea here is that if we have good implementation and good health services, then we should reach those patient-level effectiveness outcomes. So the other thing that I mentioned that I'll talk about in this section is determinants. So this is the idea that it's not just that you do something well, like that you deliver it the way you're supposed to deliver it, but there might be things about your inner setting, your organization, yourself, that actually have something to do with those implementation outcomes. So if you think of social determinants of health, like if you think about all of these factors about individual people that actually influence their health, this is similar. So it's kind of like social determinants of implementation. So what are the factors about the context in which something is being tried, like where we're trying to deliver something, that might have an association with how well it's implemented? So I'm going to talk about this one specific framework. There are several, like this is just one in D&I research, but the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, it's referred to as the CFR. It's basically, it's like 10 years old. Laura Damschroeder did this huge review of all of these theories, frameworks, and models that seemed to be related to this type of research that had already been published in the field. And then she put them all together into this massive umbrella sort of framework called the CFR. And a lot of people use this to guide the types of things that they're interested in learning about the context where implementation is happening, but also to help target implementation strategies, like what are kind of the barriers to implementation and what can we do about them. So this is the CFR figure that I did not design, but somebody did, and it gets used all the time, and people think it looks like a lot of different things, but basically it's just the CFR figure. So what we have here is characteristics of the inner setting. So these are things like the size of the organization. This could be something about leadership engagement. This could be something about morale. This could be something like readiness to adopt innovations on an organizational level. So if you think about, for example, schools as a setting for implementation, there are some schools and school systems that are really innovative, and something new comes their way, and whether it's from the top down or the bottom up, they jump on it and they implement some kind of cool program. Then there are school systems that are still doing things the way they did them 50 years ago, and nothing's ever going to change that. They are just kind of stodgy and a little bit resistant to change. And those characteristics are seen in healthcare agencies, in public health agencies, in mental health agencies, in healthcare. So an organization itself has characteristics that can be really strongly associated with how well you can get people to do something new. The outer setting is really where you are, so that has to do with the community in which you are, whether other people are delivering this intervention. So is there any kind of peer pressure or competition? Do people in the community think this is an important problem that needs to be addressed? So if you're trying to bring, for example, a smoking cessation intervention into a county with really high smoking rates, where tobacco is an important financial contributor to the well-being of the county, sometimes it's hard because of that outer context to get an effective new smoking cessation program going. Characteristics of the intervention are on both ends. So this would be like an original intervention kind of off the shelf, and then this would be an intervention that you've adapted in some way to fit for your setting. And intervention characteristics can be things like, is it really complicated? Like, do people think that the evidence base for it is strong? Is it user-friendly? Does it fit into the flow of what you're already doing in your agency or your setting? And so characteristics of the intervention are really important, because if people don't believe that it's important or usable or like comparatively it's less important than 6 other things I'm supposed to do today, then it's very likely that people won't implement it the way that it's supposed to be. Then you have the individuals involved. So if you think about screening protocols, for example, if you have somebody coming into primary care and they meet criteria for a certain kind of screening, there are a lot of people along the way that have to actually buy into this process to make sure that that person is referred for screening. So it could be the initial tech who's taking information from them. It could be the nurse. It could be a physician. It could be a PA. There are a lot of people involved, and if any of those people don't think this is worth their time, they might skip a step that means that that person ultimately doesn't get referred. So if you think about people's attitudes, like what's their knowledge about the issue that's being addressed, what's their self-efficacy, do they think they can do this? What are their attitudes toward evidence-based practices in general? All of those characteristics of individuals are really important. And then the last one is process. This is the 5th domain of CFR. And this is the idea that when you bring some new evidence-based practice, intervention, whatever it is, to your setting, how is it going to be implemented? Is it going to be this edict that comes down from the medical director that says, effective today at 5 p.m., this is what we're doing from now on? And does that work? Is it coming from like a chair of a department? Is it coming from some sort of like champion within a clinic who says, I know this works in other places, we really should be doing it, and encourages people? Are the individuals on the ground who are going to be involved in implementing, does anybody ever ask them if this seems like a good idea or something that they're willing to try? So the process of implementation is really important, and there's ways that you can assess differences in process and see if they're associated with how well something ends up being implemented. Okay, so the last thing in this bullet point is implementation strategies. So we've talked about implementation outcomes, we've talked about determinants of implementation, using CFR as an example, and now we're going to talk about implementation strategies. So, okay, this is kind of parallel to interventions. So if we think about smoking cessation, say somebody's smoking, we want them to stop, we have a smoking cessation intervention. We want that to be implemented through local health departments across the whole state. That might be our goal. So the intervention is the smoking cessation program. Implementation strategies are the things that we do to get the agencies to implement the smoking cessation intervention. So it's sort of like it is an intervention, but it's like a level up. And so they call it a strategy instead of an intervention to keep you from getting tangled in your head about these two levels of things that are going on at the same time. So if we have a smoking cessation intervention and it works and it's easy, and if you follow the steps, you're gonna get really high rates of smoking cessation, that's exciting. Now we need to think about implementation strategies. What do we need to do to get people on board to be able to do this with high levels of fidelity, to do it with every single person who comes across their doorstep who should be receiving it, and to make sure that we achieve public health impact? So there are several. This is Byron Powell. He just came back to WashU, actually, in St. Louis. They have a big dissemination and implementation group there. So he's defined it in a couple of ways. One is a systematic intervention process to get basically evidence-based innovations into usual care. That's what an implementation strategy is. Or you can think of it as the active ingredients in moving evidence-based interventions into usual care. Or you can think of it as how to make doing the right thing easy. Like, what can you do to make it as easy as possible for people to do what you're asking them to do? So there's actually a couple of these articles by Byron Powell and also Enola Proctor, and these are a bunch of people at WashU, who have done a lot of compilations and sort of specifying all the possible implementation strategies out there. So these include things like planning, training, like training the people who are supposed to do it. Like, that seems like a pretty reasonable implementation strategy. Financing, so is it something like pay for performance, or are you going to dock people for not doing something? Restructuring to make something easier to do within the setting that you're in. Quality improvement is a kind of an implementation strategy. Policy making, changing or adopting new policies, that's an implementation strategy. So there are a ton of them, but not all of them work. So generally speaking, passive methods of implementation strategies are pretty ineffective. So receiving a memo, like on Friday at 5, that you're supposed to start doing something differently, typically doesn't work. You get very low rates of people doing what you've asked them to do. So you don't want to be passive. Training, if you look at the literature in implementation science, training is the most frequently used implementation strategy. So it's like, okay, we want to improve diabetic retinopathy screening. We'll use Anna's example. And the way that we're going to do that is by training all of our providers in this new thing, like this new way that we want them to do it, and then we're going to leave, and they're all going to go back to where they were, and then the chances are very good that they're not going to do it, because there are other things in the way. It's not just training. So they might know it, and I'm sure you all have had this happen, like you get trained in something, but when you return to your regular job and your regular context, it's frequently really hard to do this new thing that you've learned. So training, typically not enough. What tends to work the best is if you have a multi-component, multi-level strategy. So this is the same for behavioral interventions in general. You know, like any kind of behavioral intervention, if you're targeting more than one level and you have more than one component, those tend to be more effective interventions. So similarly, if we have something like training plus consultation and audit and feedback and pay for performance, putting all of those components together in our implementation strategy maximizes the chances that people are actually going to do what we want them to do. Okay, so before I go into an example, do people have questions just about what the field is and about anything that I asked you or was describing about outcomes, determinants, and strategies? I'm going to give you kind of a concrete study example. Okay, if you think of something, you can interrupt me because, as I said, it's my favorite thing to talk about, and I'll like go off on a tangent but come right back so we won't miss anything. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of a study. This is the R1 actually that I'm doing right now. This is a study about implementing a parenting intervention with parents of young children who are deaf and hard of hearing. The reason I'm going to take a step away from D&I and just give you a little kind of context for why I do a lot of work in parenting. So I think most people have probably by now heard of adverse childhood experiences. So we now, dating back from like the 90s, we have a lot of data that shows that when young children, infants and young children, and even in the womb, are exposed to adverse childhood experiences, it has a pretty long-term negative impact on their quality of life, health, and mental health. So adverse childhood experiences are basically described in categories, and this is kind of the original version of what ACEs are. There's a few different ways to define them. But the way that you determine somebody's ACE score is you look at all these categories of adverse childhood experiences that you might have experienced, and if you had something within a category happen to you or you experienced it, that's a point. So it's not the frequency of the things happening in the categories, it's just whether or not something in this category happened to you as a child. So the score, the original score can range from 0 to 9, and these are the original 9 categories around physical and sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, and then 5 different indicators of some family dysfunction. So I will just say I teach this in I don't remember which class, it was an evidence-based public health class, and we looked at this, and then there's always this moment of silence where everybody looks at that list and like calculates their ACE score, and then are alarmed when I show you the next slide. So don't be alarmed because it's a determinant, but it doesn't mean that it's automatically related to negative health outcomes because there's resilience and all sorts of positive things too. The mechanism by which we think that adverse childhood experiences may influence health and well-being is the experience, people are exposed to these experiences. It could be some sort of disrupted neurodevelopment, which leads to different types of impairment in social, emotional, and cognitive functioning, which is related to adopting risky health behaviors, which then leads to all sorts of negative disability, social problems, and ultimately early death. So for example, these are these sort of dose-response figures that show on the x-axis for each one of these is the number of ACE categories that somebody reports, and then on the y-axis is the percent of the population that is kind of positive for whatever this thing is. So the higher your number of ACE categories, the higher the percentage of the population that is high risk for HIV, or that smokes, or that is diagnosed with diabetes as an adult, or that experiences cardiovascular disease. Same things happen with mental health and disability outcomes. So over and over again, we see a lot of publications about how ACEs, like how this early childhood exposure relates to your adult health, including like multiple types of morbidity and mortality. And anybody who's lived in Kentucky for any length of time, oh yes, Vicki.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So if you took socioeconomic status and education and extrapolated those
Yep.
on top of ACEs,
So people have added like poverty as an ACE itself because they still independently are related to the outcomes, but when you put them together, they're more powerful. So when I say those 9, there are more developed models of ACEs that have happened since the 90s that incorporate other things that weren't initially thought of as adverse childhood exposures. But there's also just a correlation between poverty and all of those 9 categories, you know, or low education levels of the parent. All the things are pretty intertwined. So if you look at a nice heat map of the US, as usual, we zero in on Kentucky, which is red, as it always is, for almost everything that we look at. And in this particular heat map, what we're looking at is the prevalence of children under the age of 17 who've experienced 2 or more ACEs. So we're red, which means that Kentucky is significantly higher than the national proportion. This is from kind of an old National Survey of Children's Health. So the prevalence, the US average is 22.6% of kids have experienced 2 or more ACEs, and in Kentucky it's more like 31. So we have a higher prevalence, as we do, of many things. But the good news is that there's a lot of research on this. And so like, what do we do? So ACEs happen. You can't always prevent them. It would be nice if we could. How can we remediate the effects of them? Or what can we do to build resilience to make sure that if kids are exposed to things at an early age, they have a better chance of coming out of it without the negative long-term impacts that we've seen. So this is from a CDC website. They look at violence prevention, and they're specifically talking here about ACEs. And they, one of the interventions, which is a preventive intervention that they list, is parent training programs. So that's the area that I used to do clinically before I became a researcher, and so I was really interested in looking at how this might be a way to address this problem. So we've got something like 40 years of data on this particular kind of parenting intervention called behavioral parent training. And we see from all of these decades of research that when you deliver it well to parents who participate and are engaged, you can see improvements in parenting behaviors, child behaviors, and then a reduction in long-term negative consequences that we would see associated with a lot of child behavioral issues in early childhood. So those include things like school failure, alcohol use, juvenile justice involvement, being dependent on social service and safety nets as an adult. So there's a whole bunch of these outcomes that we see with little kids who are struggling. But when you deliver behavioral parent training to their parents, you can see a reduction in those long-term outcomes and immediate improvements in parenting and child behaviors. There is this one specific model that we use in a lot of our studies because it is brief and tailored and strengths-based. So if anybody has worked with parents, you don't want to tell a parent that you're doing a parenting class with them. You don't want to. It is just a touchy subject. Even if you have a family that is really struggling, you want to engage with them and partner with the family. So this particular family checkup model involves some structured assessments, evidence-based assessments actually, and a feedback session, and then provides parents with a very low dose, because it's a preventive intervention, of some very specific skills training. And so, whereas a lot of behavioral parent training programs are like 12 sessions long, 2 hours a week for 12 weeks in a row, often in groups of families, you tend to get a lot of dropout from interventions like that. Like in the real world, people just don't spend the time, and they can't keep up with that. This can be done in somewhere between 3 and 6 sessions. Like you can do more, but you can actually get the whole intervention in 2 to 3 sessions. So it just works better, especially from a public health standpoint of getting out there and getting as many people into it as possible. And so there's a pretty good body of research on the family checkup that shows the same kinds of outcomes as we see in most behavioral parent training programs, even though it's tailored and brief. So that's pretty awesome. We see improvements in parenting behaviors. We actually see decreased depressive symptoms in mothers. We see reductions in coercive parenting, and then we see all these great kid-level outcomes too. So the problem here, and the reason why D&I is, this is why this project is part of a D&I presentation, is that even though we really do have a ton of evidence about how effective these programs are, they really don't get delivered. So a ton of kids who could benefit from them don't receive them. So most estimates say that out of every 10 kids who could benefit if their parents receive behavioral parent training, fewer than 2 actually do. And those reasons are multi-level. So there's a lot of reasons people don't take advantage of these or don't receive them. So some of them are kind of at the individual and interpersonal levels, like stigma, other social determinants of health which get in their way. These are really stressed families often, so they're the hardest people to engage in interventions. Often they don't even know that there's like something that they should be accessing. There's no awareness or identification. But then at the higher levels, we also have a lack of training. So we don't have that many people out in real world settings who are trained in evidence-based parenting interventions. We also have competing demands in service settings and lack of mental health providers in a lot of places, and then a lot of fragmentation among our systems that serve kids and families. So there's a ton of reasons why these services just don't get out there. Which leads to this project. So this is behavioral parent training for families with deaf and hard of hearing preschoolers. This was funded by NIDCD. And on this team, Matt Bush is another KL2 scholar graduate. And then we have Phil Westgate, who's a statistician in public health, and Janine Lohman, who's in health sciences. She's an SLP, speech and language pathologist. And then we have partners at University of Louisville and at the state. And Julie Jacobs is our project director. And this is something that you will see in pretty much any D&I study. So it is rare that you have an investigator who works with a little team and gets a project done. So the whole point of this is community engagement, like identifying stakeholders in whatever system that you're trying to implement change in, having stakeholders. I mean, it is a huge endeavor. So if you're actually going to do a D&I type project, one of the very first things you have to do is figure out who all the players are, who you need to have involved. And that can include things like state offices, like State Department for Public Health or Education or Mental Health. It can involve payers like Medicaid. It can involve private insurance. It can involve the people who run systems like medical directors and administrators. So you just have to think kind of broadly about who all the people are who you actually need on board to do a project like this. So this is a list of all of our, I think most, maybe not all, but all of our collaborators on this particular project. And the very first thing we did, actually with CCTS funding for this project, was in a preliminary study, we developed a community advisory board. So community advisory boards are amazing for D&I studies. And the idea is that you have a team of people who actually guide you all the way through. You present ideas to them, they give you feedback, you have barriers you encounter, they give you solutions, they tell you about things that you haven't even thought of, that you didn't realize you should have been thinking of. They bring more people in, they connect you to the right people. They also really are kind of an authority on whether this is something that you should even be doing at all. So these are, we actually have more people on it now, but this particular community advisory board has been around now for, I want to say 3 years probably, 2 or 3 years. And we meet about quarterly. We meet at Good Foods Co-op here in Lexington, and we eat lunch. Like, so nobody gets paid. They drive in from across the state, and they're just really excited to be involved in this kind of project. Also with CCTS funding, what drove the impetus for this study in the first place was Matt Bush. So he's an ENT surgeon, and he works in clinic a ton during the week. And he and I in the KL2 program got to know each other and realized that we had this crossover in interests. So I was really interested in child behavior and parenting, and he was seeing a lot of parents who were struggling with their kids' behavior when they were coming to clinic. And these were specifically kids who were deaf and hard of hearing and used cochlear implants or hearing aids. And so we started talking about it, and we were like, I wonder if anybody's looked at this before. So we started off with a literature review and found some information that suggested that kids who are deaf and hard of hearing have a higher prevalence of behavioral issues. Most of those studies come out of speech, language, and hearing fields who assume it's a language and communication issue. So they're like, well, you know, it's frustration, they don't have, they can't understand very well, the child's articulation is poor, their language development is behind, and that's why this is happening. So that could be the case. But few of those studies were using the kind of measures that we would use like in a mental health field or behavioral field to look at child behavior. So we decided, we got funding, and we did a preliminary study where we looked at 3 groups of kids. So these were preschool age kids with hearing aids, kids with cochlear implants, kids with typical hearing. And we used a ton of measures with these families, so just general parental concern, but we also used a structured clinical diagnostic interview to look for symptoms of oppositional defiant disorder, which is like kids acting out, breaking rules, not following directions, being aggressive. And we also looked at measures of impairment. So how much do your child's behavioral or emotional issues limit your family functioning, like make you not go out or take your kid to the store or miss family outings that you would be going on otherwise. So or cause stress in school settings, whatever it might be. So we measured all of these things and discovered, so the stars are where there was a statistically significant difference in prevalence in the groups. There were about 40 kids in each group. So parental concern, for kids in this age range, about 10% of parents were concerned about their child's emotional and behavioral functioning, compared to about 40% among the kids who are deaf and hard of hearing. Same kind of spread over there with meeting diagnostic criteria based on that structured interview for oppositional defiant disorder, and even worse really for impairment. And then we'll come back to mental health services in a second. So in this study, we also controlled for language development, because that was done in most of the previous studies. If the reason is language development, then when kids' language development improves or progresses, then you should see a reduction in the behavioral issues, but you really don't. Like, this seems to persist over time. So that led to talking again to the CCTS, because we decided we needed to do a qualitative study to follow this up, because we realized even that there might have even been some underreporting there by the parents of the kids who are deaf and hard of hearing, because they would look at, like, we're using a reliable, valid measure of child behavior, and the parent would say something like, well, right, she doesn't follow directions, but it's because she can't hear. So instead of checking that happens frequently, they would check no on that question, or it doesn't happen. So we were like, okay, we need to get more information than we can get from quantitative measures, and we're going to just interview some families. So we did about 20 parent interviews, and I've honestly never in my life done any interviews like this. We've done a lot of qualitative interviews over the years. I think like 80% of the parents cried in the interview. They feel really alone. They feel guilty. They often don't know why their child was born deaf or hard of hearing. They constantly question whether they're doing the right thing. They have a zillion appointments to keep up with, so just like any parent of a child with a special healthcare need. They go into audiologists sometimes, and they can, audiologists can actually plug the hearing aid in and see how much the kid is wearing it. They want the kids to be wearing it every waking hour, and it turns out they're only wearing it maybe 3 hours a day, and so the audiologist will say, you need to make him wear it, and the parent is like, I can't, like he takes it off, he's throwing it out of the car, he flushes it down the toilet, but the audiologist is just like hardcore, like he needs to wear it, put it back in. And so we have parents who feel like, nobody understands what it's like to live with these kids. So this was really significant in the progression of the project, and this was important because this was getting the perspective of the parents, like on the ground, and whether this was even something that they thought was needed, some sort of parent support program. So based on those, we were like, yes, it seems like maybe we should develop something to work with these families who aren't getting this at all. So we did a little pilot project. We took the family checkup just as it is, like kind of, we call it off the shelf, and we trained a couple of clinical psychology doctoral students to train it. They're good interventionists, and we had about 12 families in this little pilot. And what we learned from that was, so we couldn't look at outcomes, but what we learned was that we could get parents in the study, that they were willing to be randomized. We had 100% of them complete baseline, and almost all but one completed all their sessions in post-intervention assessment. The interventionists did fidelity checklists, and we did clinical supervision with them. And of the 6 who got the family checkup, 5 gave it a 4 or higher, like on a 5-point Likert scale as their average on a satisfaction measure. So we were like, okay, this looks pretty good. But they also told us that the intervention had nothing to do with them. They were like, okay, it's good, and it's nice to have somebody to talk about parenting with, but they don't have kids. One parent said, if you haven't lived with a deaf kid, you have no idea what my life is like. And so they were really telling us that the intervention itself didn't incorporate any information about kids who were deaf. There was nothing specific about language. So there were all these things that they felt like were just a mismatch between their life and what the parenting intervention addresses. Because it's really designed for a broad age range of children and just kind of typical parents out in the world. So then coming back to our preliminary data, one of the most interesting things was, even though this wasn't statistically significant, was that when we asked, we had something like 40 kids who were deaf and hard of hearing and 20 who had typical hearing, 40 who had typical hearing, about 8% of those preschool age kids had access, who with typical hearing had access some sort of mental health or behavioral services, which is about what we would expect on a national level. So some under 10%, but over 5%, of preschool age kids have usually encountered a mental health provider in some way. But of these kids who were deaf and hard of hearing, 0, not a single one had ever seen a licensed clinical social worker, a behavioral counselor, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, none. And they get a ton of services, so that might be why. They have PT, OT, speech and language, audiology. They're in a lot, but they don't get this piece at all for some reason. So what we decided was that we would think about this from a kind of take a step back and think about how could this be something that is worked into the full spectrum of care that kids get. We know behavioral parent training works, and this is a population that seems to really, really need it, and they're definitely not getting it. So in doing that, to kind of make this argument of why it would be needed, everything except for these 3 over here. This is your typical model of how people tend to think about hearing impairment, hearing loss, or deafness being related to behavioral issues. So generally speaking, people think about congenital hearing loss at birth, language development delays, and then that relates to behavioral problems because of mostly communication type issues. And so the standard of care is if parents choose hearing health care, if they don't choose deaf culture, but they choose hearing health care, then you have hearing aids, cochlear implants, speech and language therapy, and that's basically what families get, plus some PT and OT. So our thought was, no matter why this problem developed, this behavioral issue developed, this almost doesn't matter over here. The thing that does happen is that there's this coercive parent-child cycle that happens. So I don't know how many people in the room have children, but what happens when you have children is that they have certain things that they do that push your buttons, no matter how awesome of a parent you are, and you react in an inadvertently negative way. Sometimes you accidentally reinforce that behavior, not on purpose, and then they do more of it, and then you get angrier, and then you have this terrible cycle that happens, and it becomes really entrenched. So even when you are a mindful, reflective, like say you're a person who maybe, let's just take an example, did this kind of therapy in a previous life, like me, for like 12 years I worked with parents. As a parent myself, I suck. Like my kids we have this coercive cycle going on. So what we decided was the only way, like if this is the case, like and even when language development improves, you still have these behavioral issues, what needs to be interrupted is that coercive parent-child cycle. And you just need to basically give the parent some strategies to address their child's behaviors differently and break that cycle that goes on. So that's where like this novel component came in. So the overall goal of this study, this is a different kind of effectiveness or implementation trial. We wanted to take the family checkup and adapt it for this particular population, which means we have to change some things about it because they didn't think that it really spoke to them enough, right? They didn't think it was salient to them. So we want to better meet the needs of this particular population. Because we're changing the intervention in some specific ways, we still need to look at its effectiveness. Like we cannot skip over that and assume it's going to work once we've changed all this stuff. So we're going to make some adaptations and then look at how effective it is in the child and parent outcomes, but also collect implementation data so that if we find that this is effective and we see these good outcomes in the parents and the kids, we will be ready to actually launch this. And we will have all sorts of data available to us that will help us figure out how to get agencies or organizations to adopt it. So we're going to know the cost and we're going to know the acceptability, and I'll talk about some more things that we'll know. So the goal here really is to kind of skip a phase of that 17-year, like we're down at the end now because we know that these are effective. We're going to do some tweaking of it, but we would like to get it out there as soon as possible if we find that it's effective. So that term at the bottom, this is the actual term for it is a type 1 hybrid effectiveness implementation trial. So Jeff Curran has a great article, if you're interested in this, that kind of defines what these are. What it is, if you look again at that kind of pathway where you start with clinical efficacy and then you move to effectiveness and then you've got implementation research and then you actually get to that public health impact where it's out in the world for real and everybody who needs it is getting it. Between effectiveness and implementation, you can sort of blend those two stages to make this go faster, which is our goal here. So in this kind of hybrid, you're still really looking at effectiveness. For some reason, your effectiveness evidence may not be enough at this point, but what you want to do is also look at implementation at the same time so that you can speed up this process. If you're doing a type 2 trial, you're actually focusing equally on effectiveness and implementation at the same time. So you might be looking at patient-level outcomes of an intervention or a treatment, and at the same time, you might be looking at the outcomes of an implementation strategy that you're using, or two types of implementation strategies that you're using. So your study is designed and powered for both of those things at the same time. And then in a type 3, you're like, we don't need to look at effectiveness anymore. Like, we know this works no matter what we do and where it's delivered as long as it's done correctly, so we can skip effectiveness. We're going to look only at implementation. So we're going to try out these implementation strategies and test them like in a randomized controlled trial. And just to appease that little tiny bit of doubt in our mind, we'll collect effectiveness data so that we can take a look and make sure that it still seems to be working the way that it's supposed to work. So these are the three types of hybrids. And again, this study that I'm talking about is over here because we're doing enough to the intervention and it's with a totally new population that we feel like we kind of do have to actually assess effectiveness. So the aims of the study, the first aim is that adaptation phase. So we have all that preliminary data, but what we wanted to do was additional key informant interviews with some more parents about specific things that we needed to do to the intervention to make it fit like this population better. And then we also did focus groups with direct service providers to this population. So these were audiologists, speech and language pathologists, and then early childhood educators of the deaf and hard of hearing. So we did separate focus groups for all those groups. And we asked them a ton of questions about child behavior, parenting, and we showed them what this off-the-shelf intervention looks like, and then got a ton of feedback from them about what we should do to it. This crazy slide is adapted. So back here, Wingood and DiClemente's adaptive framework. So the idea here is, in the real world, if we weren't doing a research study, if I went out and tried to, I paired up with a bunch of pediatric primary care practices and said, we're gonna deliver this intervention, probably changes would happen to it. Like they would do something. They would add a session that they thought was important that we were missing, or they might do it in fewer minutes, or they might do it as a group instead of individual. We don't know what they would do, but they would do something to make it work better for them, and we'd have no way of like knowing whether that was a good idea and whether it affected, it would just be on the fly. And so we could go back and track that, but we couldn't control it if that's how adaptations happen. So in implementation science, there is an emphasis on systematic adaptation. So adapted is one framework, and there are many others, but they basically give you a step-by-step process to justify changes that you make and the types of changes that you make. So that's what this insane-looking slide is. There are basically 8 phases in adapted, where you start by looking at the actual patients, like what are their preferences, what do they want, do they think this is important? You decide on what is the specific evidence-based intervention that you're going to use. You then figure out how it needs to be adapted, how you're going to maintain fidelity, what the people who are experts on this intervention say about the changes that you have made. You come up basically with a final adapted version of your intervention. Then you figure out how to get it delivered and how to assess the outcomes, and then you do like a little test at the end. So as you can see on the right side, basically all the phases of adapted match up with the aims of the project. So that was kind of our guiding framework, was to go through these steps. The second aim is the effectiveness aim. So we're looking at the effects of the family checkup, DHH, which is for deaf and hard of hearing, families with deaf and hard of hearing kids, on 4 key outcomes. Oh, and that's wrong, it's actually 16. We have 10 publicly funded healthcare clinics plus 6 private or academic healthcare settings, hearing healthcare settings, that we're partnering with across the state. And what we're going to be measuring as effectiveness outcomes are the parenting behaviors, the child behaviors, and then because of the specific population, we're going to be looking at their language development and also whether they use their hearing aids and cochlear implants the way that they're supposed to be. So that's one of the most common behavioral issues in these families, is truly that the kids, like, they do throw them out of the car, they flush them down the toilet, they feed them the dog, they put them in the trash, or they just tantrum about them, and the parents are like, okay, forget it. It's just so much work to get your kid to keep them in. So we think that these 2 things are going to be linked. So the higher adherence with wearing their hearing healthcare equipment, we should see improvements in language development. But there's also some really good data from other populations that shows that the kind of parenting skills that parents use in these interventions actually expose their kids to more language. And so just doing the parenting intervention itself might actually improve child language too. So those are our effectiveness outcomes. And then in aim 3, this is our implementation aim. So we're going to look at 2 things in this aim. One are those preliminary implementation outcomes. So that was like the feasibility, acceptability, adoption, and I'll come back to that in a second. And the other is those factors influencing implementation, so the determinants. So we'll be looking at things like the interventionist characteristics, who are the people that we're training, their perceptions of the intervention, some community level stuff. So we have a range of CFER type constructs we'll measure. So we have our aim 1 results from that first phase. And I kind of mentioned this when we did the second 20 interviews. So now we have a total of 40 parent interviews. We just heard these things over and over again, like just parents being very unsure of themselves, experiencing a lot of guilt and doubt, feeling very alone. Sometimes speech and language pathologists work more with the kid than the parent, and the parent doesn't always see themselves as needing to kind of follow up and use the same strategies in day-to-day life as the speech and language therapist is using with their kids. So we kind of thought, parents talked about that a lot, like feeling like they wish they knew more of the stuff that they could do to help enhance their kids' communication. They all perceive a link between the child's hearing level and their behaviors. They all, almost all of them, not all, that's not true, but a good chunk of them say that they parent those kids differently. So if they have siblings, they think that they sometimes let the child who is deaf get away with things because they're not always sure if they heard them or not, or their expectations are a little bit different of that child, or that child is really tired, like has been in school all day, and if you've worn a hearing aid, it's like super noisy and overwhelming and exhausting mentally, and so they kind of cut those kids a break, but that's probably not resulting in the kind of behaviors that they want to see in the long run. Few available resources, that's definitely the case across the state, this non-adherence question. And then they had a lot of preferences about what the program should address, who the interventionist should be, and where it should happen. So this is especially important because we wrote this grant, and the reviewers always, they kind of, our program officer said, like, put some examples in, like, what do you think these adaptations are going to be? And we put things in, and then all of them got shot down in AIM 1. Like, every single thing that we said we were going to do, the parents said, no, we don't want that. And we're like, oh, God. So it was a very exciting year, and I'll tell you about that in a second. And that's something about this kind of research. Like, it never, ever goes the way that you want it to. It is messy. I mean, it's fun for that reason, but like, oh my gosh, basically if I go back and look at the original version of the grant, I can like cross off entire pages that we are not doing anymore because the parents didn't want that. In the stakeholder focus groups, they basically verified this behavioral concern issue. They recognize that parents need more support. We had one audiologist that we talked to, and I said to her, we've had a lot of parents like get really emotional during these interviews, and they talk about crying like at the audiology appointments. What do you do? Like, how does that affect you as a provider? And she was like, like we didn't learn that, like so there's like a lot of kind of recognizing that parents need additional support, but not having that training themselves. Like, so they don't always feel very comfortable with parents who are frustrated or who they perceive as needy, or parents who aren't doing what they think that the parents should be doing, but it's possible that that parent is really trying and that they're having a lot of struggles with their child. So there's a lot of this going on. Also, we learned that a lot of the parenting skills are really consistent with the strategies that speech and language therapists use. And so we were like, well, good, then we can kind of integrate those things into the actual parenting intervention. This was a bummer. No one originally could identify any organization, agency, setting, or provider who would like own this. So if we find out it works through a research study that ends in 5 years, that's awesome, but like, who's gonna do it? So the whole point of implementation science is that it actually lives somewhere, right? And it continues and is sustainable. So that was challenging, and we worked a lot on it, and I'll tell you about our solution. And then they kind of verified that hearing healthcare was the place to find these parents, because they're all, if their kids have hearing aids and cochlear implants, they are coming into hearing healthcare. And if you want to access the whole population, that's where you have to get them. So the adaptations we ended up making. First was that, like I said, the original family checkup is kind of geared toward a broad age range of children from 0 to 17. So some of the examples that are used in the parent materials, they do these like role play sessions with an interventionist. They learn new skills, they practice them, they come back and they troubleshoot. That's kind of what the intervention is like. And it would say something like, Joey stayed out past his 9 p.m. curfew. And these are all parents of 2 to 5 year olds, like at baseline. So we would be super concerned if Joey was staying out past the 9 p.m. curfew. So some of them just needed to be changed. So we did some really basic kind of adapting the content of role plays to make sure that they were specific to young children, and then also that some of them incorporated something about the child being deaf or hard of hearing, including like sometimes it's that they won't wear their equipment, or sometimes it's that they're tired after wearing it all day, or whatever it might be. So we just did a lot of kind of content adaptations here. We also learned that a lot of parents don't really know what they should be expecting of their kid at a certain age. So sometimes they're like babying them a lot, and these kids could probably be doing a lot more than they're doing. The parents are like doing for them. And that's partially because they don't really know what to expect of their kid at specific ages. And on the reverse side, we had some parents who were really frustrated with their kid because they thought they should be doing a lot more things than it might be appropriate of a kid 3 years older with typical hearing, for example. So there just seemed to be like a lack of clarity around child development. The communication toolbox, this was the idea that to communicate with your child in the context of parenting, if your child can't understand you and you feel like the communication between the two of you is not going well, you're not going to really get very far in your parenting strategies. And so we basically collected from an enormous range of existing agencies resources to help the interventionists kind of build communication skills and strategies into the intervention. So it's not its own standalone session, but it's just woven throughout the whole thing. Advocacy is up on the upper right-hand corner. So a lot of parents told us that, well, everything goes well when they're with them, but then they send their kid to this daycare center, and the daycare doesn't make them wear their hearing aids, or the daycare kind of undermines something that they're doing, or the grandparent does. Like, that's a really common complaint. And a lot of parents don't know what to do about that. Or like the baseball coach, there was a great example of like, well, the baseball coach thinks if he's wearing his ears, which is what they call their hearing aids, then he can hear, so he'll yell at him across the field, and then he gets mad, like if he's not responding, or if he doesn't follow directions. So first you question, should that guy be coaching Little League Baseball, but especially with 5-year-olds. But then you kind of question, like, how confident is the parent in intervening with the other caregivers in the child's life, or teachers, or whoever it might be. So there's an advocacy component built in. And then the last adaptation is the one that is most exciting and scary at the same time, which is that the parents really wanted other parents of kids who are deaf and hard of hearing to be the interventionists. So they did not want a mental health professional, they did not want telemedicine from UK, they didn't want clinical social workers, psychologists. They were like, it has to be another parent. So we had done, the R34 I mentioned earlier was a similar project where we were in Eastern Kentucky. These were just typical families in Eastern Kentucky. They also didn't want medical healthcare or mental health professionals or people from UK or telemedicine. They wanted lay health, like community health workers from their own towns to be the people delivering the intervention. So that requires a lot of work because that means you have to train people who don't have a mental health background at all to deliver a behavioral parent training program to a group that experiences a high level of behavioral issues. So that is super challenging. So Hands and Voices is a national parent support organization for parents of kids who are deaf and hard of hearing. They're in most states and they're here in Kentucky. So they've basically partnered with us, and they have this program called Guide by Your Side where parents who are really interested in helping other parents, what they typically do is like emotional support and this unbiased sort of support with parents who are deciding the route to go, like deaf culture or hearing aids, like they do parent cafes and informal support groups, stuff like that. So they are actually being trained to deliver the intervention in the study. The overall design is like in year 1 we did all of this adaptation work. We are getting ready, we are running a little behind, but we are in year 2 and we are getting ready to launch the actual trial. So it's a cluster randomized trial. We've got the 16 hearing healthcare practices that are all randomized to either intervention or control. We will end up with 75 parent-child dyads per group. We've got the Hands and Voices coaches, and then we're doing assessments every 6 months as we go through the project. So the main focus is on the effectiveness outcomes, the parent behavior, child behavior, hearing aid and cochlear implant compliance, and language outcomes. But then we're also going to be collecting implementation data. So the next couple slides just give you an idea of how many things we're measuring. So this is, like Tom Kelly said to me earlier today, you're under a lot of stress. Like if we were talking about moving, which is true, but actually this might be more stressful than moving. So we have a whole bunch of effectiveness outcomes and measures that we're using that families are either doing annually or every 6 months, depending on what the measure is. My Lord, you all. And then we are looking at implementation outcomes. So we're looking at the ones that we have selected for this study are feasibility, fidelity, acceptability, costs, and adoption. So we have some actual measures of acceptability, like quantitative measures that we can use with the parents and the interventionists. We have the people who developed the family checkup have a great fidelity measure that we're using. We will be using process data for feasibility and adoption. So we're basically collecting from all the interventionists as they go what they're doing in each session, like fidelity checklists, how often they see families, how long those sessions are. And that's how we're going to be calculating costs as well. And then we have those CFER constructs. So these are those 5 domains of things that we think affect how well this intervention is going to be delivered. And so there's just there's a combination of both quantitative and qualitative measures that we're using, including process data. to see if we can identify, if we realize, for example, that certain interventionists or settings are doing better than others in terms of implementation, then we can kind of just explore and see what it is that might be related to that. But again, that's not a primary outcome of the study. So right now, literally last week, we just did this training up here. So these, everybody signed a photo release. They're so sweet. So these are Hands and Voices parent coaches, the top 3 photos. And this is, we've done like 2 in-person trainings with them so far and have some more webinars. They have a licensed clinical social worker who's been trained as their supervisor and is certified in the family checkup, who will be doing individual and group supervision with them all the way through the project. And then on the bottom, these are our data collectors who all had to learn how to administer child language measures, which are really complicated. So we've had several trainings. This is the back of my car, like the night before that training. It was like 10 o'clock at night, and we were loading everything into the back of my car so I could drive it to the Boone Center, which is literally across the street from my building, because it was too much stuff to get over there, so I had to like drive it over and unload. So this is the phase that we are in right now. So I don't have any effectiveness or implementation outcomes for you yet. Okay, in a minute I'll take questions, but I'm going to show you this slide, and then I'll make sure that Vicki and Tom have this, that if you're interested in implementation research at all, this is a pretty good list of a lot of resources that you can access to learn more. So TIDER is an in-person, well, part remote, part in-person training institute that NIH sponsors, and that's where I got trained in implementation science. It is hard to get into it. There's a very high demand for this institute, but if you are someone who is unusual to the implementation field, like sometimes that's a helpful characteristic to help get into this particular training, but there's more information about it. It's annual, and there's information up there. There's also TIDERC, so if anybody is in the cancer area, they have specifically basically taken TIDER and developed a version of it that is specific to people interested in cancer. And this TIDERC Open Access, they just took everything from TIDERC, which is the same kind of training program that TIDER is with a cancer focus, and made it open to anybody. So you can just click on that link and you can get everything that they use in their training and read it yourself. Implementation Science at a Glance just came out this year. So if anybody has seen Theory at a Glance, there's like a Karen Glanz, if you're interested in health behavior, there's this great Theory at a Glance book. And this is similar. So it's basically like a free PDF that's an overview of everything I just talked about, but gives a lot more resources and examples. There's a new free mini course on implementation science through the Center for Implementation that is only open for registration for like another week and a half. I think it ends November 11th, and it's a self-paced online training program that is free. Implementation Science is the journal for this field. It's open access, so you can just Google it, like just put in Implementation Science, it'll come up and you can read all their articles. And it's my favorite journal. Just put in a plug. There is an annual conference every year in December in Washington, D.C. that's sponsored by the NIH and Academy Health and the VA and some other sponsors, and it's awesome. So if you ever are interested in this, so Anna Carvalho met with me, I guess it was last fall when we started working together, and she was like, I'm interested in D&I, and I was like, oh, you should go to this conference, and while we were sitting at the table, she registered. Like, she just sat there, and I was like, oh, I haven't even registered yet. And then she went, and she met amazing people. She got mentors on her application. She learned a ton of stuff. It's a great, great, great conference. NCI is where implementation science is housed at the NIH. So they have an implementation science program, a D&I program there, and that's their website. They have tons of webinars and resources and links and training opportunities. There's just a ton of stuff on there. This is a newsletter. I can't remember now where it comes out of anymore because it's moved, but it's like the Consortium for Implementation Science. So they send out like highlighted important articles that just came out, as well as like postdocs and faculty positions that are open that have an implementation science or D&I focus. So it's fabulous, free. Like, this is where you sign up for it, is at that link. And then, as Vicki said at the very beginning, the NIH is really interested in this field. So there is a specific FOA that is like a D&I FOA. There's an I think there's an R01 and there must be an R21, but and that's like a very specific dissemination and implementation research in health is what it's called. But that is not the only way to get D&I research funding. So lots of different FOAs and lots of different institutes have an interest in this field, and you can often, if you read their bullet point of things that they're interested in with a given funding announcement, dissemination and implementation is almost always in there. You can almost always find it. And so the way that my research has been funded, there's actually a study section at NIH called DIRH, which is a pretty hardcore study section, and I've been afraid to submit anything to them, honestly, because I feel like my research is kind of applied. And so the way that I have gone about this is by looking for study sections that are interested in my topical area, writing a D&I application, and then asking, requesting that they have implementation science expertise on the panel when it gets reviewed. And that has worked great for me. I've had 2 in a row funded, and it's competitive to get funding. So anything you can do to maximize your chances is good. So asking for that is helpful. And NIH knows now they have a big roster of people who they invite in to come sit as ad hoc members of study sections to review grant applications for this. So that's a list of opportunities and resources. I'll finish up by just saying, basically, this field gives you these systematic approaches for adapting, understanding factors associated with implementation, figuring out what strategies are needed to help all of these interventions and programs and treatments get out into the real world and be sustained, and then also even speed things up by combining effectiveness and implementation outcomes together in the same study. And parenting interventions in general are a really good example of this, because we have 40 years of effectiveness data, and then we have really limited implementation in the real world. And then we have even worse outcomes in terms of reach when we look at underserved communities and populations. So we have really limited public health impact of something that should be a lot more powerful than it is. And at UK, these are just some examples. There have been, so Sakara Fisher left, but she was doing kind of an investigation of parent and stakeholder perceptions of barriers and facilitators to doing a prevention intervention around alcohol use for African American adolescents in high schools. This one is Matt Bush is doing a study on using patient navigators to help get babies who failed their newborn hearing screens in for diagnostic testing more quickly, especially in areas of the state where there are delays. This one is precision medicine. So this was, oh my gosh, I just blanked on her name, Jill Colasar. So she had something on molecular tumor boards being implemented with community providers. What is this? Oh, lung cancer screening. That's my husband, Jamie Studts. So that's on basically taking high quality lung cancer screening and getting it implemented across 10 different hospital sites in Kentucky. This one is a currently funded R34 that Michelle Staten in behavioral science is leading, and that's on reducing sexual risk reduction around HCV and HIV for women who inject drugs who are incarcerated in rural jails. That is a mouthful, but that's what that project is. And then that's Anna's, telemedicine diabetic retinopathy screening. So she's doing a classic, awesome, assess barriers and facilitators, and then design implementation strategies to improve implementation. So all of these are at UK, and then that's your area. So you have to think about, in your field, what should be being done that isn't being done, and how could you use implementation science to move the field forward and really make sure that what we want reaches the people that it was intended to reach. That's it. That's all the teams, the people, the funding, including the CCTS and all of our partners. And then I can answer any questions that you have.